In this tutorial, we'll learn plenty of useful CSS features, how to add shadows, how to handle overflows, how to rotate, scale, and move elements, how to configure opacity of your elements and their colors, HTML and CSS comments, how to align your text, change its font family, and more, how to position elements, and how to include external CSS libraries. All these features are great to learn because you'll apply them in your projects. Next up, we'll learn how to add shadows with CSS. For that, create a simple HTML5 page with just one div inside the body that we're going to be experimenting on. To generate the skeleton of the page, use the !tab shortcut. Okay, also we're going to need a CSS rule that targets the div. I've added these simple styles to make the div a little bit prettier. So if you want, add these too. Here we're making the div 120 pixels wide with some padding and margin and border. And also we're adding these nice round corners. And so the div is going to look like this in the browser. Nothing crazy and no shadows so far. Now let's add a shadow to the div. For that, we'll use a new property called box shadow. We're going to move our shadow 4 pixels to the right, space, 4 pixels down, space. We'll start with no blur, so 0, and again, space. The shadow is going to be of the same size as the element, so 0, 2, and space. And let's make it black. The shadow value might seem complicated at first, but we'll discuss its every part and you'll see that it's easy to use. So this is going to add this to our element. The shadow is black, 4 pixels down, 4 pixels to the right, the same size and without any blur. Now I'm going to inspect the div to open the developer tools so that we can easily discuss and experiment with the shadow. And let's switch to the Styles tab to see the box shadow property. So the box shadow property is what we typically use to add shadows to our HTML elements. If I turn the property off, the shadow is gone, and if I turn it on, it's back. The first value here configures where our shadow is horizontally. If I increase the value, the shadow moves more to the right. If I decrease the value, it moves to the left, and when it becomes negative, the shadow is to the left of the element. So, use the first value to configure how far the shadow is to the right or to the left. The second value configures the vertical position of our shadow. If I increase it, the shadow moves further down. And if I decrease it, the shadow moves up. When the second value is negative, the shadow goes above the element. And when it's positive, the shadow is below the element. So the first two values of the box shadow property configure where the shadow is. Now I'll reload the page to reset the shadow position to its original value. Next, let's change the third value to 1 pixel and see what happens to our shadow. And okay, it became a little blurry. And this is what the third value does. It configures how blurry the shadow is. The higher the third value is, the blurrier the shadow becomes. And when we set it to 0, there is no blur. Also, we can't use negative values for blur. If I try to do this, the shadow disappears completely, because this value is not valid. So use the third value to configure how blurry your shadow will be. And I'll reload the page to reset the value. Next, let's set the fourth value here to 1 pixel and see what happens in the browser. Reload the page. Okay, it made our shadow to grow in size a little bit, which means that the fourth value affects the size of the shadow. If I increase the value, the shadow grows from all sides. And if I decrease the value, it shrinks. Also here we can use negative values, which makes the shadow to be less than the element. Let me move our shadow 40 pixels to the right, maybe even 400 pixels to the right, so that you can see that more easily, like this. And I'll reset the value again. And finally, the last value here sets the color of our shadow. Just like with background colors and text colors and border colors, we can use color keywords here like black or red. And we can also use RGB and hex colors here too. Let me show you. For that, I'm going to remove the black color here. And next, I'm going to type RGB parentheses to use an RGB color here. And then let's come up with some random numbers between 0 and 255 for each color channel. So for the red, let's use, say, 132. And for the green, it's going to be 25. And for the blue, 194. This sets the color of our shadow to this. Also, notice that the shadow repeats the shape of our element. And it has these round corners, just like the element. If I remove the border radius property, it's going to change the corners of our element and our shadow to this. And this is how you add shadows with the box shadow property. Use the first value to configure its horizontal position. Use the second value to configure its vertical position. Use the third value to configure how blurry the shadow is. Use the fourth value to configure the size of your shadow, and the fifth value to configure its color. Here, we're using the box shadow property to add one shadow to the element. But we can use the property to add multiple shadows to one element if we want. Let me show you. So to add multiple shadows to one element, we simply need to separate them with a comma. And then we can add a second shadow just like we added the first one. So I'm going to copy the first shadow and then paste it after the comma. Now let's change this and this to -4s to place the second shadow 4 pixels to the left and 4 pixels up. Let's also change the shadow color to green. And so now this should add, yes, the second shadow to our element. Notice that we can configure these two shadows separately. So here we positioned the second shadow differently. Let's also set the blur here to 0 and the extra size to 0 too. And now the second shadow isn't blurry and it's a little bit smaller in the browser. And now, here is a challenge for you. Add a third shadow to this div. And for that, use a comma, just like we used for the second shadow. Make the third shadow to be 12 pixels to the right and 10 pixels up. Add 2 pixels of blur, no extra size, and it'll be red. So pause the video and try to add that third shadow to this div. Okay, and now let's do this together. To add the third shadow, I'm going to add a comma here. We want it to be 12 pixels to the right, so the value will be positive. And then 10 pixels up. This is why the value is negative. Then 2 pixels of blur, no extra size, and the color will be red. And if I reload the page, here is our third shadow. This is how you add multiple shadows to one element in CSS. Now let's have some fun and make the shadows appear only when we hover over the div and also animate it. For that, we'll add another CSS rule that targets the hover state of the div. Then we'll move the box shadow property into this new rule to make the shadow appear only on hover, like this. Now let's make the shadows to appear smoothly on hover. For that, we'll need to add the transition property to the main rule to make it smooth both on hover and hover out. And here we want to transition the box shadow property like this. let's set the duration of the transition to half a second. And now when I hover over the div, the shadows appear smoothly, and when I hover out the div, they disappear smoothly, like this. For some reason, I find this oddly satisfying. So this means that we can animate our shadows using the transition property. Okay, and here's an extra challenge for you to have more practice. Change the current CSS code for the shadows to be visible all the time, and then make them smoothly change their position to the opposite on hover, like this. So pause the video and try to code this behavior. And this is it for shadows. Additionally, if you want to improve your learning, then I would highly recommend to pause the video after each topic and then try to come up with 1 or 2 challenges for yourself where you can apply the topic that you learned, and then try to write code to complete those challenges. I used this approach when I was learning how to code, and it helped me a lot. Next up, let's discuss overflows in CSS. For that, I've created a simple HTML5 page, and I used the exclamation mark tab shortcut to generate the skeleton of the page. There's also a div with this class and this empty CSS rule that targets the div. Now let's fill the div with some text. For that, we'll write lorem and then multiply it by 3. The bigger this multiplier is, the more text VS Code will generate. And then I'll press tab. So this created this Latin text that is called lorem ipsum. The text has no special meaning and is commonly used as a text placeholder to have some content to style. In the browser, it's going to look like this, just some placeholder text. And let's also add some border around the text. It's going to be 1 pixel solid green, like this. Now, because this text is inside a div, which is a block element, it takes the whole width available. And when there is not enough horizontal space, the browser places the text that follows on the next line. This continues until the whole text is displayed. The content area of this div by default is as big as the content itself, the border is around the content, and everything looks fine. Now, let's restrict the height of this div to 210 pixels and see what happens. Reload the page. Okay, this made the border to overlap the text. And part of the text goes beyond the border, which means that this part of the text that goes beyond the border is outside the content area of the div, and now this text outside the border overflows the div. Okay, but what does this mean and how does it affect the page? Well, first of all, you can see that the text and the border are now overlapping. Then, if I add another element after the div, let's add a paragraph, and it will be paragraph of text. When I reload the page, notice that the overflowing text now falls onto the paragraph. So this overflowing content is visible but doesn't push other elements away. And most likely you wouldn't want your content to look like this. So let's discuss how we can handle this. Okay, so first of all, overflow is what happens when there is too much content to fit in an element. Like in our case, there is too much text to fit in the div. When this happens, by default, CSS just shows the content that overflows, like here. But we can manage that with CSS using the overflow property. Let's see what we can do with it. So by default, the value is visible, which makes the content that overflows to be displayed by the browser. We can set the value to hidden. This does exactly what it says and hides the content when it overflows. But often we want to show scroll bars to be able to scroll and see the rest of the content. For that, we can change the value to scroll, like this. And now I can scroll down to see the rest of the text. When we're using the scroll value, the actual appearance in the browser depends on your operating system and also the browser you're using to view the page and the browser settings. For example, in Chrome on Mac OS, the scroll bar only visible when there is overflow and I'm scrolling the content. But in Chrome on Windows, I've got both horizontal and vertical scroll bars visible all the time, even when there is no overflowing content. And this is what happens when you're using the scroll value for the overflow property. But if you want the scroll bars to only be visible when there is overflow, then use the auto value instead. This allows the browser to figure out if it should display scroll bars. And in Chrome on macOS, it works exactly the same as with the scroll value. But on Windows, now there is only this vertical scroll bar and there is no horizontal scroll bar. And if there is no overflow, then the scroll bars are not displayed. Okay, so by default, the browser moves your text to the next line if there is not enough horizontal space. This creates this vertical overflow and this vertical scroll bar. But now let's use another CSS property called white space to make our text stay on the same line so that we create horizontal overflow. And we want to use the no wrap value here for that. So this will make our text stay on the same line. And if I reload the page, it's on the same line. And now there is this horizontal overflow and we can see the horizontal scroll to see the rest of the text. And in this scenario, if I change the overflow value to hidden, then this hides all that horizontal overflowing content and there are no scroll bars to see it. So this is how you can use the overflow property to control how the browser handles overflow for your content. And in the Reddit clone project, we'll use the overflow property to create these two scroll bars for the fixed sidebars. And now here is a challenge for you to practice overflows. Try to use an image inside a div instead of text. And then make the width and height of the div smaller than the width and the height of your image. And then apply the overflow property to the div to hide the rest of the image. Then add scroll bars to be able to see the rest of the image by scrolling inside the div. Next up, we'll learn how to use the transform property in CSS to rotate, scale, and move elements on our page. For that, we've got this simple HTML5 page and also this button. The button has this class, and also there is an empty CSS rule that targets the button, and also this CSS rule that adds some padding inside the body to have space for our experiments. We haven't discussed buttons before, but they are very simple HTML elements that create buttons like this. And whatever text we put inside the button, it's going to appear on the page as a clickable button because the browser styles its hover and also active states by default. And when I click this button, nothing happens because most of the time we need to apply JavaScript to make the button do something. Now let's learn what we can do with the transform property, and we're going to use this button for our experiment. First, let's write here the following: transform, rotate, parenthesis, and then 30 deg for degrees. And this rotates the button 30 degrees clockwise. The bigger the value in parenthesis is, the more the button is rotated clockwise. So if I set it to 130 degrees, then it's going to look like this. If I set it to 230 degrees, it's going to look like this. And the value for the full turn is 360 degrees. Setting the value to 360 makes the button to rotate the full turn, and it's going to look the same as when we set it to 0 here. It's impossible to tell that it's been rotated with the 360 value because the rotation happens instantly. But let's make it gradual so that you can see it better and it's also fun. So for that, we'll update this selector to target only the hover state of the button. And if I hover over the button now, again, nothing happens because the rotation happens instantly. And to make it happen over time, when we hover over the button, we'll add another CSS rule that targets the button in its all states. Then we'll use the transition property, and we want smooth transition for the transform property like this. Let's make it over 1 second. Now, when I hover over the button, it smoothly rotates and makes one full turn. And if we want to rotate it in the opposite direction, we can use negative value here. So if I change this to negative 360, then it's going to rotate the button counterclockwise, like this. What's important is that when the transform property is applied to an element, it only affects how the element looks. It doesn't affect other elements on the page. So, for example, if I add a div beside the button, and then fill it with some text. So I'm going to write lorem and press tab. This adds this text to the page. And when I hover over the button, it rotates, overlaps the text, but doesn't push the text or doesn't affect it in any way. Okay, another thing we can do with the transform property is we can change the size of our elements. So let's remove this and write the following: scale, parenthesis, 200%. And with this, if I hover over the button, it becomes 2 times bigger smoothly over 1 second. So the scale here allows us to resize our elements. 100% here is for the normal size of our elements. And we can use values that are under 100 to make elements smaller and over 100 to make elements bigger. So if I change this value to say 50% and also lets the transition to happen more quickly. And now when I hover over the button, it becomes this small. Now here is a challenge for you. Use the transform property to increase the button size to 102% on hover. And also add another CSS rule that targets the active state of the button and uses the transform property to decrease the button size to 95% when we click it. Now pause the video and try to code that. Now let's do it together. We want to scale this button to 102% on hover, like this. Then we'll add another CSS rule to target the active state of the button. Here we want to use the transform property to scale the button down to 95%. So now when I hover over the button, it becomes slightly bigger, and when I click the button, it becomes smaller. Great. What's cool about the transform property is that we can use it with any HTML elements. For example, we can also use it to scale this div. So let's use the selector list we learned in the previous tutorial to also scale the div on hover and on click. For that, I'll extend this rule and write comma, then div, hover. And so here we're targeting both the button in its hover state and also all the divs in their hover state. And then we set their transform property to scale to 102%. Now, when I hover over the div, it becomes bigger. Notice that the change happens instantly. This is because in this rule, we're adding the transition property only to the button. Let's fix that and also use the selector list to target all the divs. And this is better. Next, let's also scale down the div on click. This will be a challenge for you. So extend this CSS rule to also target the divs so that when we click the div, it scales down to 95%, just like this button. So pause this video and try to complete the challenge. Okay, now let me do this. So I'm going to write div active, and this selector list ensures that the transform property is applied also to all the divs in their active state. And now when I click this div, it becomes smaller. Okay, there is one more feature of the transform property that I'd like to show you. We can use it to move elements around. Let's do that on hover and move elements 10 pixels to the right. To do this, I'm going to remove this, and then I'll write translate and parentheses. Inside of the parentheses, we can specify a value here in pixels, like 10 pixels. This should move the button and the divs on hover 10 pixels to the right from their original position. If I reload the page and hover over the div, 10 pixels to the right and the button too. If we want to move the element further away, we can just use a bigger value here, and it's going to look like this. Let me undo it to 10 pixels because 50 is too much. Okay, so this moves elements horizontally. To move elements vertically, we can add a comma here, and then we can use a value in pixels here too. If I write 15 pixels here, this will move our elements 15 pixels down, but also 10 pixels to the right, like this and this. If we want to move our elements to the left instead of the right, then use a negative value here, and this makes our elements move to the left. And if we want to move them up instead of down, we can use a negative value here, like this. And this is how you can use the transform property to rotate, scale, and move elements around without affecting other elements. Okay, before we discuss how to use the opacity property, I'm going to remove all these styles and rules, and I'll leave only this rule that targets the button. Next, let's add the transform property, which is going to rotate the button 90 degrees clockwise like this. And let's also make the button 2 times bigger. For that, I'll update this property and right here space and then scale 200 pixels. And this makes our button 2 times bigger. So to apply multiple transformations, just separate them with a space. Okay, these transformations made our button quite big, and now it's overlapping this text. And we did all of that so that we can start learning a new CSS property called opacity that is widely used and can be quite handy. So the property is opacity, and its default value is 1. This means that our button by default is fully opaque, that is, we cannot see anything behind it. Now let's change the opacity to 0.9. This makes our button to be a little bit transparent, and now we can see the content that's behind it. If we decrease the value even more to say 0.5, then the button will become even more transparent and we can see the content behind it better. And if I set the opacity value to 0, this makes the button to become fully transparent and we cannot see it on the page. But the button is still there and it's fully functioning. We just cannot see it. The opacity property is widely used for different animations. For example, in the Bootstrap library, which is one of the most popular CSS libraries nowadays, notice that when I launch the modal, it appears gradually from 0 opacity to fully opaque. And there is also this gray backdrop that is partially transparent here too. So we can configure the opacity with values that are between 0 and 1, where 1 makes the element to be fully opaque and 0 makes it to be fully transparent. And if I set a value to something in the middle, this will make the element partially transparent. Now, when we use the opacity property, it's been applied to everything in that element. I mean, notice that the border of this button is transparent, and also its background is transparent, and also the text. And if there were any nested HTML elements inside this button, the opacity would affect them too. So the opacity property affects every part of the element and also its children elements. But sometimes we want to only change the opacity of some parts of an element. So let me show you how we can do that with colors. And for that, I'm going to set the background color property of our color to be RGB and 239, 239, and 239. And also let me remove the opacity property. So this sets the background color to this, and if I reload the page, the background color looks like this, but setting the background also resets the border styles, but this doesn't matter for now. And now let's make only the background of our button to be slightly transparent. For that, we will update the color value here, and we will add the A letter to the color format. Now, this tells the browser that we also want to configure the opacity of the background color. And it's A because it's for alpha channel, which comes from computer graphics, and for our purposes, we can think of this as just opacity. And this allows us to add a fourth value to our color. And just like with the opacity property, we can use values in the range between 0 and 1 for the fourth value. Let's set it to 0.5. And so this should make this color to be 50% transparent. And if I reload the page, it becomes transparent. But notice that now only the background color is this transparent. And this text and the border, they are fully opaque. What's cool here is that we can use the RGBA color format in all the places where we used the RGB to configure color. So you can use this for the text color, the border color, the background color, the shadow color, and so on. Let me show you this with the border color. We'll add the border property, and it's going to be 2 pixels solid RGBA. And we'll use the black color here, so all zeros. And let's make this color to be fully opaque at first. So for that, I set the value to 1. And this makes it look like this on the page. And when the color is fully opaque, this means that we cannot see through it. But if I reduce this value and set it to, say, 0.7 and reload the page, now we can see through the border. Because now it's 70% opaque and 30% transparent. The less opaque the element, or the more it's transparent, the better we can see through the color. And so here is a challenge for you. Change the color of this text to be black, but to be 50% transparent. And after that, make the color of the text to be fully transparent so that we cannot see the text at all. So now pause the video and try to code that. Now let's do this together. For that, I'll add the color property to set the text color. We'll use the RGBA color format. Then we'll add all zeros to make it black. To make the color 50% transparent or half transparent, I'll use the 0.5 value like this. This makes the text to be black and also half transparent. Now to make it fully transparent, I'm going to update the value and set it to 0. And there you go, completely invisible text. So use the RGBA color format if you want to configure the transparency of your colors. And also use the opacity property to configure the overall transparency of your elements. Next, we'll look at HTML comments. You create a comment with less than, exclamation mark, dash dash to start, and dash dash greater than to end. Everything you type in between these markers, browser ignores and won't display. Let's write here pizza ordering form, all caps, for us to easily recognize what this form is about. Comments can also span multiple lines. Let's start a comment here and end it here. This way, our pizza size options won't appear on the page. There you go, our pizza size radio buttons are gone. HTML comments don't appear on the web page, but are visible in the page source code. So avoid leaving sensitive information there. To view the source code in Chrome, click View, Developer, View Source Code. And there they are, our comments. Comments are useful when you want to leave notes for yourself and other developers about what your code does. They are also useful when you're testing out different bits of code and want to temporarily turn off a piece without deleting it. You wrap it in a comment, and it's like it's not even there. That's what we did with the pizza size code. Let's discuss how to write comments in CSS. It's actually quite easy to do. In CSS, we start a comment with a slash and an asterisk, with no spaces or other symbols in between. Then, we can write any text we want, like green text, for example. The browser will ignore it anyway, because comments are for us, humans. We end our comment with an asterisk and a slash, again with no spaces or other symbols in between. Now, if I save the file and run the script, nothing has changed. That's because when the browser renders our web page, it ignores comments completely. But if we view the source code of this page, and for that I'm going to click the right mouse button in any free area of this web page and select View Page Source. This is the HTML source code the browser uses to render the page, and there is our comment. And because comments do not affect how our page looks or works, we can also use comments to disable our code temporarily. It's great for quickly testing different CSS code without deleting it. I'm going to close the source code. Now let me show you how to use CSS comments to disable this declaration that turns paragraphs and company text color green. For that, I'm gonna add slash asterisk to start a comment at the beginning of the declaration that I want to turn off, and I'm gonna add asterisk slash to end this comment. Notice that VS Code changed the color of this code into gray. This means that it's now a CSS comment, and this part of the code is turned off. In programming, it's called to comment out this code. And if I save the file and refresh the page, now the paragraphs are black, so default color, and the header is blue. Let me uncomment this declaration. There you go. You can also comment out just a part of a line like this. And instead of green, I'm gonna write red. Save the file, refresh the page. Now the text is red and the green value is completely ignored by the browser. You can also comment out multiple lines. Let's disable all these CSS rules. For that, I'm gonna start our comment here and I'm gonna put the ending comment mark here. Save the file, refresh the page. Now those CSS rules aren't applied. If you are using a code editor like VS Code, there is a shortcut to toggle your comments. Let me show you. I'm gonna select our comment and go to the edit menu and select the toggle line comment option. There you go, VS Code uncommented this code. And if I want to comment out this code, I can go to the edit menu and use the toggle line comment option again. There you go. Now VS Code commented out this code. You're gonna comment out and uncomment your code quite frequently, so I recommend you to learn the keyboard shortcut for this action. For that, go to the edit menu again, and to the right of this option you can see the shortcut. For Mac, the shortcut is Command/. So if I hit Command/, now VS Code has uncommented this portion of the code. I can also put the cursor on any line and use the Command/ shortcut again. VS Code has commented this specific line where the cursor is. And if I use the shortcut again, VS Code hasn't commented this line. You can also comment out a portion of your code. For that, select the code you want to comment out, go to the edit menu and use the toggle block comment option. There you go. Now VS Code commented out only the selected portion of the code. And if I use that option again, the VS Code has uncommented this code. We can use those options to toggle comments in HTML too. So if I place the cursor somewhere on this line and hit Command/, now VS Code has turned this HTML into a comment. And if I hit Command/ again, the comment is gone. If you're using a different code editor like Sublime Text, just Google what shortcut to use in your editor to toggle comments. It's a real time saver. So to add comments in CSS, use /* to start a comment and */ to end that comment. Use comments in CSS to explain your code where needed or turn off parts of your CSS code. Comments might not look very useful, but you'll use them a lot during development to temporarily turn off and on bits of your code. And this is how you add comments in CSS. Let's discuss how to change the alignment of your text with the text align property. We can align our text to the left, center, or to the right. And our browser aligns most of the text to the left by default. Let's create that in code. For that, I'm going to close this tab and we will start from the blank page. First, let's add some HTML content for us to style. I'll add a div element and it's going to have the CSS is great text. Let's also add the class attribute and it's going to be 1. And now we'll need 2 more divs. They will have the same text, but I'm going to change the classes to 2 and 3. I'll also add the HR elements in between divs to separate them visually. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. 3 perfectly identical divs for us to style. Notice that in all these divs, the text is aligned to the left by default. Now let's align this text to the center and this text to the right. Let's start with this div. So I'm going to add a CSS rule. We'll use a class selector, so period 2. Then inside the declaration block, I'm going to use the text align property and the value will be center, semicolon. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go, the text is in the center now. To align this div's text to the right, I'll add another CSS rule and it's going to use class selector 3. Inside the declaration block, it's going to be text align right. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, it's aligned to the right. So the browser aligns text and inline elements inside the element you've applied the text align property to. Now let me show you how it's going to look like with longer text. For that, let's open the page on CSS on Wikipedia, and I will copy the first paragraph from this page and save the file, refresh the page. There you go. As you can see with the left alignment, the browser keeps all the lines of text aligned to the left. With the center alignment, it keeps all them centered. And with the right alignment, it keeps them all aligned to the right. Great! The text align property is easy to use and often used for text formatting and to center menu items. The next property, font family, is so powerful because it allows you to change the font of your text. This is the same text, but different fonts are applied from 5 main font groups or generic font families: serif, sans serif, monospace, cursive, and fantasy. We'll discuss what a generic font family is in a minute. Now let me show you how to use the font family property. For that, I'm going to remove the font style property because we don't need it for now. And I'll write font family, and we'll use the Tahoma font here. So when I refresh the page, the second div's text should use the Tahoma font. And we should be able to tell the difference between how the first and the second div's text look. So save the file, back to the browser, refresh the page. There you go. These 2 divs are using different fonts. If you run this code and the text didn't change, this means that the Tahoma font is not available in your browser. In this case, your browser uses the default font and the text in both divs should look the same. I'm going to replicate that and change the Tahoma name to something that 100% doesn't exist on my computer. So QWERTY and random. Save the file, back to the browser, refresh the page. Now they look the same. So when you specify the font that doesn't exist on user's computer, the browser will just use the default font available. When you want to use a font that contains spaces or special characters, you need to wrap that font name in quotes. As an example, I'm going to use the Courier space new font. Save the file, back to the browser, refresh the page. This text now looks very different. We can also have a list of fonts as a value for the font family. For that, we just need to separate them with comma. So I'm going to write Tahoma, comma, space. In this case, the browser will try to apply the first font from the left, and if it's not available, then it will use the second font from the list. If the second font is not available, it will try to use the third font, or if there are no fonts in this list, the browser will just use the default font. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Now the font is Tahoma. But if I change Tahoma's name to some gibberish, like this, save the file, refresh the page. Now the font is Courier New. So the browser tried to apply the first font from this list. It wasn't available, and then the browser used the Courier New font. Let me change it back to Tahoma. If you want to make sure that the font you're using is most likely available in the user's web browser, you can use a what's called web safe font. To know what fonts are web safe, just Google web safe fonts and open this first link from the V3 schools. And here's the list of the best web safe fonts for HTML and CSS. These fonts are considered web safe because they are available on most computers and devices. And we've already used the Tahoma and Courier New fonts from this list. Notice that there is additional text in parentheses. This is called a generic font family. A generic font family is a group of fonts that have common features. There are 5 most widely used generic font families on the web, and they are serif, sans serif, monospace, cursive, and fantasy. Serif fonts have small lines at the end of strokes. They are traditional and considered formal or classic. Sans serif fonts lack small lines at the end of strokes. They are modern, clean, and used for readability. Monospace fonts have equal spacing between each character. They are great for code because letters align. Cursive fonts mimic handwriting, and fantasy fonts are decorative and often used for impact. We can use a generic font family instead of a specific font name. Let's do that for all 5 font families. For that, I'm going to need to uncomment this bit of HTML, and let's have 2 more. I'm going to change this class to 4 and this class to 5. Next, I'll add a CSS rule that sets font family to serif for the first div. Then we'll change the font family of the second div to sans serif. Then we'll set the font family of the third div to monospace. Then we'll add another CSS rule for the div number 4, and its font family is going to be cursive. And another CSS rule for the div number 5, and its font family is going to be fantasy. Save the file, back to the browser, and refresh the page. There you go. Now all 5 divs are using fonts from different font families. When we specify a generic font family, like serif for example, the browser uses any font from this font family that is available in your website visitor's web browser. It's very safe to set a generic font family because the likelihood you have a font from this family is the highest. This is why if you want to set a font for your text, let's say for example I want to set the Poetsen1 font for the text of the second column, a good practice would be to specify this font first, then to add a web-safe font, for example, Tahoma, to the list as a fallback in case the Poetsen1 is missing in the user's web browser, and then, add a generic font family like sans serif, for example, as a fallback in case the Tahoma is missing. In this case, the browser will try to use the Poetsen1 font first. If it's unavailable, it will try to apply the web-safe font, and for the tiny group of users that don't even have the Tahoma font, the browser will use any sans serif font available. Let me show you now how big tech companies configure fonts for their websites. Apple, for example, for the text on their website, sets 3 custom fonts first, then 2 web-safe fonts, and then a generic font family as a fallback. Amazon uses a custom font first, then a web-safe font, and then the sans serif generic font family. YouTube uses a custom font first, then a web-safe font, and then again the sans serif generic font family. Also notice that they all are using the sans serif generic font family as a fallback. That's because sans serif fonts are clean, modern, and have a good readability. So I would recommend using the approach Amazon and YouTube apply. 1 custom font first, then a web-safe font, and then the sans serif font family. It's simple but safe, powerful, and flexible. Most of the time, you can even skip the custom font and start with a web-safe font. And this is how you set a font of your text. Use the font family property. Specify 1 or more fonts and separate them with comma. Wrap the font name in quotes if it contains spaces or special characters. Now, let's discuss how to change the line height of your text. We can make our text to become less dense vertically or more dense. The line height property sets the height of each line of text. This is crucial for readability. Let's create that in code. I'll close this tab and I will copy this text from Wikipedia about CSS. Now, to test this property, we'll need only one div. So I'm going to remove these 2 and I will leave only one CSS rule here. And also I will remove the font weight property. Now I'll paste the text from Wikipedia here and we're ready to change the line height. So it's line height. A good practice is to use a unitless value for the line height. I'm gonna put 1 here. This number is a multiplier. The browser uses the font size of this element and multiplies by this number to calculate the line height. This is flexible and convenient. In our case, the line height of this text is gonna be 1 multiplied by its font size. So it's going to be equal to its font size. Save the file and switch the tab, refresh the page. Now this text is quite dense vertically. If I change, for example, the line height to 2, save the file, refresh the page, now the line height is noticeably bigger. And if I set it to 3, save the file, refresh the page, now the line height of this text is 3 times of its font size. A good practice for text readability is to set the line height value somewhere between 1.5 and 2, where the sweet spot is 1.6. Save the file, refresh the page. This is much better. And this is how you set the line height of your text. Next up, you'll learn how to move an element relative to its original position on the screen and how to make it stay in the same position when scrolling. Then we'll use all that to create a simple modal window. By default, the browser displays HTML elements on the page in the order as they appear in HTML. In CSS, this is called normal flow. Block elements go top to bottom. Inline elements go left to right. We can remove HTML elements from the normal flow and move them around with custom CSS. I'm going to close this example and we'll start from a blank page. We need some content to style. So I'm going to create 3 paragraphs. The first one is HTML for structure. The second will be CSS for styling. And the third one is going to be PHP for backend. Save the file, refresh the page. Good. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. That's better. Now I'll style them a little bit. For that, I'll add a CSS row. I'll use a tag selector to find all the paragraphs. Let's add a solid border, 4 pixels, solid. The color will be royal blue. Okay, now I'd like them to have more space inside, so I'm going to add padding, and also I'll make them a little shorter, and I'd like to have them some background. I'll add padding 10 pixels to have padding from all sides. For the background, I'll paste a hex color, and the width is going to be 300 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. This is better. Now, let's say we want to move the CSS paragraph down and to the right. We could use margins for that. Let's add a class CSS to the paragraph and another CSS rule. Okay, remember, if we want to move our element down, we add a margin from the top. So margin top, what about 30 pixels? And if we want to move our element to the right, we add margin from the left. So margin left, 35 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Great. Now our paragraph is 30 pixels down and 35 pixels to the right. But it also pushed down the next paragraph. For certain tasks, that's fine, but for some, that's not. This time, I only want to move the CSS paragraph and not affect the others. In this case, margins won't help us. So let's remove both properties. Save the file, refresh the page. Okay, it's back to its original position. And now to only move the CSS paragraph and don't affect the other elements, we'll use a new property called position. The default value it has from the browser is static. This means act like a regular HTML element. For our goals, let's change it to relative. Save the file, refresh the page, and nothing has changed so far. But now we have access to additional properties: top, right, bottom, and left. Let's use the top property and see what happens. We'll set it to 15 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Okay, it's 15 pixels lower from its original position. And it didn't push the PHP paragraph down, just what we wanted. And if I increase the top property, say to 30 pixels, save the file, refresh the page, it even starts to overlap with the PHP paragraph, but still doesn't push it away. Great. And what about the other properties? Let's use the left property and see what happens. Say 35 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page, and it's 35 pixels to the right. Great. Now you might be thinking, that's weird. When we configured the top property, the browser moved our paragraph down. And when we set the left property, it moved to the right. And the reason for that is that the top property sets the element's distance from the top, and the left property sets the element's distance from the left. The same works for the bottom and right properties. Let's use them. I'm going to remove these. Save the file, refresh the page. The paragraph is back to its normal position. Now I'll add bottom 30 pixels and right 35 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Now it's 30 pixels to the top and 35 pixels to the left. And part of this paragraph is now even outside of this page. So when we change position to relative, we can move then that element relative to its original location with the top, right, left, and bottom properties. And this affects only where the element appears and doesn't push other elements away. And also notice that the browser keeps the space intact, as if the element is still where it originally would be. The next interesting value for the position property is absolute. It's going to give us very different results. Save the file, refresh the page. Okay, so now the CSS paragraph has moved to a completely different place. It's
35 pixels from the right and 30 pixels from the bottom of the browser window. And now there is no empty space here. These two paragraphs just collapsed as if the CSS paragraph doesn't exist. That's because when we set position absolute, we have removed the CSS paragraph from the normal flow. That is, we have moved it from the layer where normal elements are to a separate layer. Okay, now let me show you what happens with different combinations of bottom, right, left, and top properties for an absolutely positioned element. If I comment out the bottom property, so only the right is applied, the browser places our paragraph 35 pixels from the right of the screen, and it keeps its original position vertically. Now you might be asking, if it keeps its original position vertically, then it must be on the same level as the PHP paragraph. Why is it lower? That's a good question. The answer is that because now it's on its own separate layer, its top margin doesn't collapse. And so it's like when their margins are touching and there is no content between, their margins collapse. But there is content between the first and the third paragraphs. It's the CSS paragraph, you might argue. Well, the thing is that now its position is absolute. So it exists in its own little world or its own layer, and it doesn't exist for these two paragraphs that are in the normal flow. This means that at this moment, there is nothing in between these two paragraphs, and their margins are touching and collapsing. But the margin of this CSS paragraph doesn't collapse because it exists on its own separate layer. It doesn't touch anything at the moment, and so its margin pushes the CSS paragraph down. And when I inspect the paragraph, you can see that it's precisely 16 pixels lower than the PHP paragraph. And to stop margin collapsing for these two paragraphs, I can put literally any content in between. So I'm gonna add the any text after the first paragraph. Save the file, refresh the page, and there you go. Now their margins don't collapse and these two paragraphs are on the same level. Margin collapsing can give you unexpected results. The main thing to remember here is that when there are two block level elements and their margins are touching, the browser will keep only the biggest margins of those two. Okay, back to positioning. If I comment out the right option, save the file, refresh the page, now the CSS paragraph is in its original position, but on its own separate layer. So it overlaps the PHP paragraph. To prove that, I'm going to use the left property to move it, say 80 pixels from the left. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, now it's moved 80 pixels from the left, and you can see a part of the PHP paragraph. Let me zoom out a little bit to have more screen space. And now, if I comment out the left property and add the top, say 30 pixels, save the file, refresh the page, and it's now moved 30 pixels from the top. Nice. Another interesting and useful quality here is that if we use two opposite properties, like right and left, or top and bottom, let me uncomment the bottom property, save the file, refresh the page. So the browser has stretched the CSS paragraph to reach 30 pixels from the top and 30 pixels from the bottom. The same works for the right and left properties. I'll uncomment them, save the file, refresh the page, and that's not what we expected. The paragraph is clearly 80 pixels from the left, but it's not stretched up to 35 pixels from the right. Why is that? Well, that's because we manually constrain the width of all paragraphs to 300 pixels in this rule, and it prevents the CSS paragraph from being stretched with positioning. In CSS, many different properties can affect an element's dimensions. Some of them have stronger influence, like the width property. To release our CSS paragraph from this 300 pixels constraint, we can override the width property specifically for our CSS paragraph. Remember, a class selector is stronger than a tag selector. The value is going to be auto. By doing that, we tell the browser there is no width constraint for this element. You can use other things to determine its width. Save the file, refresh the page, and there you go. Now it's stretched just like we wanted. We will use this stretching feature in a couple of minutes to create our modal window. Usually, you'd want to stretch out an element completely and not have any empty space. For that, I'll change all the positioning values to 0. So that element will be 0 pixels from the bottom, 0 pixels from the right, 0 pixels from the left, and 0 pixels from the top, like this. Save the file, refresh the page, great. But notice that there is still this empty space at the top and bottom. Why is that? Let's use developer tools to find out. So Option Command I for Mac to open it. And I'm gonna inspect our paragraph. Oh, okay, it's the default paragraph's margin adds that empty space. Let's reset it to 0. You already know how to do this from previous videos. So margin 0. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, the empty space is gone. Let me close developer tools, and this is exactly what we need. Now, before we get into creating a modal window, we've got a couple more features to discuss. So for that, let's put back the CSS paragraph to the bottom right corner. I'll remove all this and add bottom 30 pixels, right 35 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Okay, at this stage, our paragraph is at the bottom right corner of the page. And our page is only one screen high, but modern websites are usually longer than one screen. Let's emulate that. For that, I'm gonna add class PHP to the third paragraph and a new CSS rule, a class selector, and the height is gonna be, say, 600 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, now our page is longer. And if I scroll down, our absolutely positioned CSS paragraph stays in its original place and eventually disappears. That's useful for some tasks. But for example, for modal windows, we would want it to stay fixed in the same place all the time. And it doesn't matter whether we scroll the page or not. For that, we'll use a different position value, which is fixed. Save the file, refresh the page. Now, when I scroll, our paragraph remains fixed in the bottom right corner all the time. Fixed position works the same as absolute. The only major difference is that the element always stays fixed relative to the screen. And we configure where it's located with the same top, right, bottom, and left properties. Let me change bottom to top and right to left. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, it's fixed at the top left of the screen. Now, let me add another paragraph. It's gonna be for MySQL. So for MySQL for storing data. And let's make this paragraph fixed at the top, 60 pixels from the top and 80 pixels from the left. Now, both paragraphs are fixed and they overlap. And sometimes you want several positioned elements to overlap like this. But also what you'd want is to control which element goes on top or behind. We can control that in several ways. At this moment, MySQL paragraph covers CSS paragraph. That's because by default, the browser displays them in the order they appear in HTML. And if I place the CSS paragraph in our HTML code after the MySQL paragraph, save the file, refresh the page, now it's on top. I wouldn't recommend, though, relying on the HTML order to control where they appear, because this makes our styles so fragile. And there is a much better way in CSS. We can use a CSS property called the index to control what elements go on top or behind. Now, if I set the z-index for the MySQL paragraph to 1, save the file, refresh the page, it goes to the front, even though the CSS paragraph is later in the HTML code. Now, if we wanted the CSS paragraph to be on top of the MySQL paragraph, we could set its z-index to a bigger number, so at least 2. Save the file, refresh the page, great. We can also set z-index to negative values. By default, all HTML elements have 0 as their z-index value. This means that if I set the z-index for the MySQL paragraph to -1, it should go behind. Save the file, refresh the page, nice. Now it's behind the elements. Now we can only use the z-index property for positioned elements to change the order in which they appear on the page. And if I set the z-index to the elements from the normal flow, let's say for this PHP paragraph, this won't affect the order the PHP paragraph appears on this page. Let me show you that. I'm gonna set the z-index property for the PHP paragraph to a very high value, say 500. Save the file, refresh the page, and nothing has changed. The CSS paragraph is still on top. So z-index controls the layer order of positioned elements on your page. Higher numbers are on top. Z-index only works on positioned elements, that is, the elements with position relative, absolute, or fixed. It doesn't affect the elements with position static, and all the HTML elements have position static by default. Higher z-index values bring elements closer to the front. Lower z-index values push elements further behind. Z-index can have negative values, pushing elements behind others. Without z-index, positioned elements stack in the order they appear in HTML. Now, let's create a modal window using what we've learned so far. First, we'll need a div. It's gonna have the modal class. And for the content, let's use a simple text, say something like, that's our modal content. And let's also add a thinking emoji here too. Save the file, refresh the page, and for now, it's just a regular div element, a part of the normal document flow. But usually modals appear over content of the page, sort of like floating above the rest. And it doesn't matter whether we scroll it or not, the modal should stay in the center. Okay, you already know that for that behavior, a perfect candidate would be to use position fixed. I'll add a new CSS rule here, and it's going to be modal position fixed. And let's place it at the top. I'll use 0. When we use 0, we don't need to put any units of measure. So I'm going to leave it like this. Save the file, refresh the page. Great. Now it's at the top. Next, I want our modal to have a nice semi-transparent black background that covers the entire web page. So I'm going to add the background property, and I'll write RGB for the color. We want the black color, so all zeros. Save the file, refresh the page. Okay, that's something. I think we need to make several improvements here. Let's make the background color semi-transparent. For that, we'll extend the color function and add the A character at the end. We've added it here to configure the alpha channel, that is the opacity of our color. Now we can add the fourth parameter, which is a decimal number between 0 and 1, where 0 is fully transparent, so the color disappears, and with 1, the color is fully opaque, like this. I want the color to be semi-transparent, so let's use 0.5. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, that's exactly what we need. Now let's stretch the modal window to cover the whole page. You already know how to do that. First, I'll add the bottom property, and it's going to be 0. This will stretch the modal vertically. Save the file, refresh the page. Good. Then I'll add left 0, right 0 to stretch our modal horizontally. Save the file, refresh the page. Good. It now covers the whole page. Notice that at this moment, the CSS paragraph is above our modal, but we want our modal window to be always on top. For that, I will assign the z-index a huge value, something like 1000. Save the file, refresh the page. Great. And if I scroll the page, the modal follows. Now, it would be nice to have a white background for our content and to move it closer to the center of the screen. For that, I'll wrap modal's content with another div that's going to have the modal content class. Good. Save the file, refresh the page. No changes in the browser so far. This is expected because we need to add another CSS rule. It's going to be a class selector, so modal content, and we want to set the background to white. Now, I could have used an RGB color here, but because we don't need any flexibility and it's a little easier to type this keyword, I used the keyword. Save the file, refresh the page. Good. Now the background is white. Next, we need to position our content div. So I'm going to add the position property, and it'll be absolute because we want to position it relative to the fixed parent. Save the file, refresh the page. Notice that now our div takes up as much space as its content, even though it's a block element. That's because when a block level element is absolutely positioned, it behaves differently and it only takes up as much space as its content. Okay, now let's move it closer to the center of the screen. For that, I'll add top, say 100 pixels, and left, say 60 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. It's better, but I want it to be more to the right. So I'm going to increase the value of the left property to 160 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. This is better. Usually a modal window has a close button. So let's add the button element, close, and let's also separate it from the text with a horizontal line. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. And lastly, let's add some padding. So I'll write padding 20 pixels to have a 20 pixels padding from all sides. Save the file, refresh the page. Nice. And there you go. We have created a modal window with CSS. If I scroll, it stays in the same place and it has a nice semi-transparent black background that covers the whole page. Now, obviously, this is just an example and not a fully working modal. It's not interactive. If I click the close button, it doesn't close the modal window. That's because we'll need to write JavaScript code to handle that. But as your first modal window, I think it's great. So congratulations. Next up, you'll learn how to include external CSS files. Then we'll include CSS Bootstrap and use a couple of its components. First, I'll show you how to create an external CSS file and use it on your web page. For that, we'll need a div element. It's going to have the PHP class. Its content will be PHP is for backend. Now let's style it a bit. I'll use a class selector and make it 500 pixels wide. The padding is going to be 20 pixels from all sides. Let's align its text to the center and add a border, 3 pixels, solid royal blue. There is nothing special here. The goal is just to have some styles that we can use in the future. Save the file, refresh the page. Good. At this point, we're keeping our CSS code in this HTML, in the style element. This is convenient and sufficient in certain cases, like when learning CSS or for running quick experiments. But most of the time, especially when your website grows or you're doing professional web development, you want to keep your CSS code in a separate file and then include and load that file into your HTML page. Let me show you how to do this. The goal is to move our CSS code to a separate file and include it into this web page. So we'll need to create a new file. For that, I'm going to open the primary side panel, create a new file, and I'm going to name it main CSS. For your CSS files, I recommend you choosing a file name that reflects the purpose of your CSS code. Like if you have a CSS file that contains styles for a navbar, then name that file something like navbar CSS. Choosing good names for your CSS files will make it easier for you and other developers to navigate your project. Now I'm going to move this CSS rule to our CSS file. And let's remove this line. Save the file. Great. And I'm also going to remove this style element. We don't need it anymore. Let's also close the primary sidebar. Either use this option or this keyboard shortcut. I'm going to hit Command B. If I save this file and refresh the page, our div is back to its default styles. Our custom styles are gone. That's because for these styles to be applied, we need to include our main CSS file into this index.html file. To do that, we'll add the link tag to the head element of the index.html file and specify the location of our CSS file with the href attribute. Our CSS file is in the same location as the index.html file. So I'll just put its name, main CSS. But as with images, we can use an external URL here to load CSS from other sources. This is what we're going to do later to load Bootstrap. A CSS style sheet is not the only thing we can load with the link element. We can use it to load many other types of resources like fav icons and fonts. Okay, next we need to tell the browser that we're loading a CSS file with the rel attribute. For CSS, the value is going to be style sheet. Don't forget to include rel style sheet, otherwise the browser won't apply your styles. Link is a self-closing tag, so I'm going to put a closing angle bracket, save the file, refresh the page. Great, the browser has successfully loaded and applied our styles. If your styles didn't load, make sure that you put the CSS file in the same folder as the index.html file. Also, make sure that you specify the exactly same file name in the href attribute. Sometimes I tend to misspell it. And also make sure that you have the rel attribute and that the value is exactly the same as I have it here. Doing all that should solve the issue. Okay, we can also put the link tag in the body element and it will still work. However, it's better to have it in the head element, because in this case, the browser loads your CSS file before any HTML code and your styles are immediately applied. Now let's include the Bootstrap CSS library. For that, I'll Google Bootstrap and open the latest version of the website. At the moment, the latest version is 5.3.3, but yours can be different. Next, scroll down to the Include via CDN section and copy the link tag. CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. CDN is basically a network of servers in various locations worldwide. The main goal for a CDN is to deliver content like images, videos, CSS, and JavaScript files to you as quickly as possible. For that, CDN uses multiple techniques, like sending you this CSS file from the server that's closest to you. Okay, we're not interested in the Bootstrap's JavaScript in this video, so just copy the CSS link and paste it after our custom styles, like this. This link has a couple of extra attributes that we don't need to worry about. Also, notice that this link loads a remote CSS file from the internet. So save the file, and when I refresh the page, it has changed a little bit. That's because Bootstrap was loaded successfully and applied its own styles. Now let's add a couple of Bootstrap components to our page. For that, I'll go to the Bootstrap's website and click on the docs link. Bootstrap has many different useful tools. I encourage you to experiment with them on your own. For now, we need the components section. And let's open the list group item. I'm gonna scroll down until I find the component I like. This one, under the custom content, looks interesting. So to use it, I'm gonna copy the content from this example and paste it to our web page. Save the file, refresh our page, and there you go. Now we've got an item list that's beautifully styled. Let's use another component. How about some spinners? Okay, so which ones to choose? I like these growing spinners. So let's copy their HTML and paste it before the list group HTML. Save the file, refresh our page. Great, we've got many spinners to choose from. Bootstrap is an amazing library and worth learning. Based on the W3 Tech statistics, it's the most used CSS library in the world. Okay, now let's recap. Use the link tag to add external style sheets to your web page. Specify the URL of your style sheet in the href attribute and tell the browser that it's CSS with the rel attribute. And this is how you add external style sheets to your web page.
Thank you for watching and see you in the next tutorial.